Welcome back. The Commission of Inquiry into State Capture will continue this morning with testimony related to alleged fraud and corruption in the Estina Dairy Farm project in Vrede in the Free State. The Deputy Director General Corporate Administration in the Free State in the Premier's office, Albertus Venter, will resume his testimony, after which the Commission will hear from two of the farm's beneficiaries. Provincial officials and the Gupta family allegedly looted more than 200 million rand meant for the project to help emerging black farmers. The DA member of the provincial legislature, Roy Jankelson, told the commission yesterday that the farm was meant to benefit about 80 farmers and it ended up only benefiting the Gupta family. Now, to recap and for what we can expect or look forward to today at the commission, we're joined in the studio by my colleague Manqoba Mchunu. The State Capture Commission, we've now moved to the Estina Dairy Farm and all these allegations of fraud and corruption. What happened yesterday?
Of course, we heard testimony from Roy Jankelson on the alleged corruption that took place during that project. Of course, he alluded to the fact that, there was a lot of wastage of public funds, and even saying that, the Premier himself at the time, as Magashule, had also admitted at the legislature that indeed there was a misuse of public funds through the project. We do know that about 240 million was siphoned out of the government pocket, and it's basically taxpayers' money, which is money that went to Esteana, a company that really was owned by somebody who doesn't have any expertise in the dairy project. It was owned by somebody who was actually an IT boss at Sahara back then. So again, linking it with the Gupta family to say this is a man that was once working with the Guptas, and all indications are that he was also a shareholder in some of the Gupta companies, and therefore he says that the Guptas were peppered all over this particular project. But I think getting back to the issue of how public funds were wasted, he spoke about, of course, the illegal contracts that were signed, saying that there were illegal contracts. You remember that the public protector as well had found that the Department of Agriculture, which was then run by the former Agriculture Minister, MEC, that is, Zwane. So again, his name popping up there. But of course, he's saying that, that department was found guilty of maladministration and that they had signed an illegal contract with Esteana. But he pointed to basically some of the diagrams, some of the pictures of the farm. I don't know if we can have them here on screen, just to show you what it was like, pointing to these diagrams. One of them being that you see where that number 1 is. That is the gate into the farm. That gate alone, Desiree, he says just to erect that gate and 2 walls next to it, that cost 2.6 million rand.
And you can actually get those images that you see when you're passing by farms where there's just a gate and a little bit of brick wall just on the side to keep the gate standing. 2.8 million rand.
2.6 million rand was paid for that gate. So it speaks to the amount of price inflations that took place in that project. Prices were inflated and lots of money was wasted. They also spoke about a shed. That was one of the sheds that was there. I think it's that one, which cost about 7.5 million rand just to erect a shed. And so he says there was a lot of price inflations there and lots of money is wasted.
Was that project. Cost specifically for the shed, or was it for the shed and the scientific requirements of that kind of process that would go inside the shed?
Apparently, we don't know just for the shed. According to Jankelson's testimony at the time, he says that all the information they had is that it was for the actual shed.
Okay.
So this speaks to the price inflation that had taken place. But he says the Premier, as well as the MEC, Zwane, then knew about this, and they knew that public monies were being used. Let's take a listen to what he said.
All right.
If one considers the content of the National Treasury Report, as well as the context of all the information that I have set out in previous paragraphs in my affidavit, then the Premier, Mr. Magashule, the former MEC Zwane, former MEC Kabate, acting MEC Lamlele, and former MEC of Finance, Elsabe Rockman, were pertinently aware of the issues and problems relating to Esteana, and in spite of that allowed substantial payments to be made towards this project while being pertinently aware of these issues.
Before we went to that clip, Manqoba, you were referring to the gate that was built for 2.6 million rand. There we see the image there. And also, as part of the testimony, the fact that the operations are still continuing at Esteana.
Of course, surprising, of course. I think many of us would have thought that, the Daily Esteana project would have died down or would have been abolished by now, because it was simply a big failure. And of course, we know that some of those beneficiaries, in fact, none of them, of the 80 beneficiaries, benefited at all from this project. They were supposed to be 51% shareholders in the company, and Esteana only owned 49%. But all the money, all the millions of rands went to Esteana instead of these beneficiaries. So none of them. And we do understand the painful stories, which they'll relate later on, about how some of them had to sell their livestock, how some of them, because many of them are emerging farmers, they had to sell their livestock in order to buy into this business, preparing for this.
Yeah.
But of course, there was nothing. They gained nothing. Not even a single cent of that project went to these farmers. But of course, Jenkelson yesterday revealing the fact that, despite the failure, this project is still costing taxpayers money, 20 million rand each and every year, which is very perplexing and surprising. Let's take a listen to what he said.
Okay.
The provincial department did continue to fund this project to the tune of 20 million rand a year after the Esteana withdrew and the Free State Development Corporation took over this project. So there was funding available from the provincial government to continue with this project. We would have thought, and that is one of the issues that is of concern to us, that after spending all this money and the time frames that had passed, that this dairy farm would be functional, that it would be sustainable, and it would be self-supporting. The fact that the provincial department had to continue to put 20 million rand into this project annually, which it is still doing as we speak, indicates that this project is not yet functional. It's not a sound running business concern, and that it still requires a huge amount of government funding.
But just throwing forward to those two beneficiaries who are expected to testify this afternoon, do we have a sense of whether they're coming to talk about the horrible stuff they went through, or if they're coming to say they benefited?
Well, they're going to obviously talk about, I think, the way in which the promises were made, especially by the former MEC, Zwane, who they say had made numerous promises about them benefiting from the fact from this project. And in fact, even when it took off and they could see that nothing was really coming off it, they say he still continued to promise them that no, it's still coming, it's still going to happen. So they're expected to share basically their stories. For example, how some of them had sold some of their properties and the hardships that they've had to go through because of this project, which just simply never took off for them, and how life has been for them. We know that some of them, one of them had even died, and apparently there were allegations that he was murdered. So they'll speak to that, maybe even intimidation, possibly intimidation if there was at all, because we do know that many were threatened not to speak on this issue.
What was said about the Public Protector's report on this project?
Well, of course, he expressed his unhappiness, Roy Jenkelson, that is, because initially he's the one that had opened or laid the complaint to the Public Protector. In fact, he did it 3 times. He laid 3 complaints with the Public Protector to look into this matter. But he says that, when that report came out, he was simply disappointed by the fact that, it had not looked at the political, some of the political heads behind this project. Because they firmly believe that as a DA, if the Department of Agriculture was the one that was found to be guilty, there must be somebody behind it who's calling the shots.
Yeah.
There must be a political head who's saying, go ahead with this. Referring possibly to Zwane.
Maybe.
And we know that, of course, he'll also need the blessing of the Premier. So they're saying that, why not look at these political heads? Why did the Public Protector not even interview them for this report? This clearly shows that this report was whitewashed and it simply protected those political heads.
So expectations today?
Well, today we're expected to hear more testimony, of course, from Albertus Venter, who's going to speak more about those contracts that were signed and some of the illegality within those contracts. Yesterday he referred a bit to some of the, what he says were deterrents, some of the, the things that were wrong with the contracts at the time that he had pinpointed. And I think divergence is the right word. So he will speak more to that at this first part, and then I think the most human interest part will be to hear from those beneficiaries who are going to give their own testimony.
So this testimony came hot on the heels of the testimony of former President Jacob Zuma. Was there still conversation about the remnants of that testimony last week?
Of course. I mean, among journalists, we were speaking, in fact, when he started testifying, Royal Enkelson, how, slow it was coming, how, most of us finding it a bit, boring at times, from what we saw last week, where there was just constant energy, just constant, adrenaline rush amongst journalists. So, we're picking up after last week, but of course, the commission must go on and the testimonies must be given. And yeah, we're following the pace, whatever the pace is. The important part is that they're trying to find the truth into state capture. And yeah, so.
And thanks to you for bringing us all the highlights. Manqoba Mchunu, our colleague who's covering the State Capture Commission. Let's